All right, thanks everyone for coming. This is way more of a turnout than I expected, and really appreciate everyone who came here or helped promote the event in any way. Hi, I'm Matt Hayek. I am a fourth-year graduate student here in the School of Engineering and Applied Science in the Environmental and Science Engineering area. I work with Steve Woofsy measuring greenhouse gases and reactive trace gases in the atmosphere above the Amazon rainforest. But today I wanted to talk to you guys about something totally different, which is that about 9 years ago I went vegetarian, and shortly after, a year later, I went vegan. And just to catch you guys up on the definitions, so we're all on the same page here, a vegetarian, or the way that I'm going to use it, is somebody who doesn't eat any meat, fish, poultry, any flesh of an animal. And a vegan is somebody who avoids all animal products. So whether that be meat or eggs, dairy, any byproducts like wool, clothing like leather. Two things have happened since the 8 years ago that I went vegan. One of which is that countless people have been coming to me and asking me questions about what my reasons for going vegan were, and I generally felt that that was a larger conversation than just kind of quickly and in passing. So I wanted to turn that into a bigger discussion. And the second one is that a lot of scientific articles have come out kind of verifying and quantifying some of the negative impacts of meat and dairy, or conversely, the positive impacts of adopting a diet that consists of more plants. So what I wanted to try to do is synthesize and present some of those scientific studies, some of that information in a new and compelling way. And there really is a bounty of evidence that's starting to add up that I've kind of divided in this presentation into three main areas, one of which are the environmental impacts, specifically the impact of feeding nearly 7 billion people, soon to be 9 billion projected for 2050, on an increasingly meat and dairy-rich diets. The second of which is animal sentience and welfare, specifically research that deals more with the social and emotional and perhaps rational intelligence of animals. And the third one is health and nutrition, because while I can convey some of the information in the first two topics, I think it's important to show that people who eat more plants can not only survive on them, but thrive. The first topic I wanted to cover is the environmental impacts. And what you see here are some pictures to give you a preview of some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this discussion. So up at the top, you have a picture of a so-called contained animal feeding operation, something that other people call factory farms. These are really confined spaces where eating, sleeping, and breeding can be intensely managed and regulated. And part of this type of intensive animal agriculture are considerable health and environmental risks. So one potential consequence from the manure of an environment like this is that it can run off into freshwater ecosystems, resulting in toxic algae blooms. Algal blooms can in turn use up oxygen in freshwater systems and suffocate and kill fish. And over in the left-hand corner, what you see is a situation that's more typical of the developing world, and specifically the tropical developing world, which is that slash and burn is used as a technique to remove large swaths of rainforest to graze cattle on pasture. These pastures are then used up and overgrazed until ranchers move on to the next patch of forest. So while there are a lot of environmental arguments dealing with animal agriculture, a central concept to a lot of these arguments, as I saw, is one of ecological efficiency, which basically states that as you move up from plants, which ultimately get their energy by fixing sugars from energy derived from the sun, the amount of energy that's retained in the growth of the next animal is only about 10%, with the remaining 90% being lost in the form of wastes, specifically urine and feces and heat. So the idea is that if we start eating lower on the food chain and eat more plants directly, we could roughly feed 10 times more people or only grow 1/10 of the plants. And because of the scale of factory farming and feeding, those wastes are huge. These wastes can translate directly into food scarcity. Specifically, we feed more than 3 times the amount of human edible food to animals than what we get for their meat. Now, this 3 times number, the reason it looks different from that 10% figure is because this doesn't take into account a lot of the pastures and forest crops that are also grown to meet the caloric or energetic demands of all the meat and dairy we're rearing. In the US, about 60% of all corn production and 40% of all soy production, two of the main crops we grow in the United States, are used just for feeding animals and not for feeding humans. 70% of all agricultural land, that's 30% of all land on the planet, is appropriated to either growing food for animals or growing animals themselves. And because so much land is needed to raise food for animals, meat and dairy drive ecosystem loss and deforestation. So, for example, 77% of recent Amazon deforestation was for cattle pasture. This is out of the 110,000, it doesn't happen to say in Brazil, deforested between 2002 and 2008. That's, for that total deforestation number, that's a rate of about 1 state of Vermont per year. Deforestation and other practices can also accelerate climate change. And this is a number that some of you may have seen before in the news. It's been repeated a few times now, that 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture. Carbon dioxide from the uprooting of natural ecosystems like forests, which I mentioned previously, and synthetic fertilizer production. Methane from the fermentation in the stomachs of cows, the fermentation of the grass that they eat, and anaerobic manure management, and nitrous oxide for feed crop fertilizer and manure decomposition or denitrification. Together, the carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, the amount that these emissions actually heat the planet is slightly more than the exhaust of all vehicles combined on Earth, which amount to about 16% of our emissions. Furthermore, in a lot of the kind of environmentalism literature or outreach or push, there's a push towards more local foods as a way to reduce our carbon footprint. But a study out of Carnegie Mellon in 2008 added up all the emissions in the life cycle of our food from the field to our plates and found that 83%, now this is in the United States, 83% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions from our food system comes from the production of our food, and only about 11% is from the transport, with only 4% being the emissions to take that food or transport that food from the final stage of its processing to the grocery store or wholesaler. While there may be many benefits to a local food system, which I wouldn't deny, including putting money back into local economies and building stronger social ties around our food, it appears that we need to change what we eat and not just where we're getting it from. So far I've talked about some environmental issues like food scarcity, land, and the climate. But water scarcity and toxicity are also major concerns for the near future. And 70% of all herbicides in the US are used just for the corn and soy that I mentioned previously that are grown for animal feed. That's over 100,000 metric tons per year, 70,000 of which are used just on these 2 feed crops. But toxic chemicals are only one way that animal agriculture affects freshwater systems or freshwater resources. And about 15% of all the fresh water used in the United States is used just for the irrigation for animal feed. This feed is then fed to animals, which then comes out the other end as manure. And about 1/3 of all of the nitrogen and phosphorus loads and the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that go into freshwater systems is estimated to come from animal agriculture. So in trying to summarize some of these environmental impacts that animal agriculture can cause, we've talked so far about food scarcity, climate change, pollution, and freshwater depletion. This isn't to mention any additional problems of erosion, acid rain, or the proliferation of antibiotics in some of those contained animal feeding operations that could potentially lead to antibiotic resistance in human populations. It's a staggering problem, but one that I think we can immediately start to address by impacting change on the demand end, that is, on our local diets. But I want to turn your attention to, at this point now, animal sentience and welfare. Because while so far I've directed the discussion, this environmental discussion, to talk about how animals are really potentially inefficient ways to get our calories and our nutrients, I think focusing on animals merely as ways to produce our food, as just these units that we convert calories from plants to our plates, ignores a more fundamental point, which is that animals, even domesticated ones, are really complex creatures with rich and varied lives of their own. This advocacy to consider animals' lives and their welfare can be traced back to about the 18th century, when Jeremy Bentham, who was a forefather of utilitarianism, which is a philosophical movement that seeks to increase the amount of well-being there is in the world, said that a full-grown horse or a dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant. The question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And as it turns out, there's an increasing amount of evidence that they can do some version, potentially do some version of all three. So to backtrack a little bit, something that I'm not sure that I emphasized fully before, and this is the only slide like this in the presentation. So 98% of all US meat, dairy, and eggs come from operations like this, and like that slide I showed you in the very beginning. These contained animal feeding operations or factory farms, which are environments in which, to increase production and efficiency, and in some ways to actually lessen the environmental impact on a per animal basis, producers completely disregard any sense of well-being that these animals might have. Chickens are regularly debeaked without any anesthesia. Cows and calves are separated so that they can get more milk from the mother and ship the cows off to veal crates. Used up cows are then in turn, once they stop producing as much milk as they did in their young age, sent off to the grinders. And baby male chicks, which are useless to hen breeders, to egg hen breeders, are simply discarded. But we know that animals have an awareness of their environments and are capable of suffering, and new studies kind of only add evidence to this claim. Cows and chickens are capable of developing deep social bonds. They can remember over 100 of their peers. They can form hierarchies. They can hold grudges, and they can express concern for others' well-beings in certain ways. Even baby chicks apparently are capable of something like addition and subtraction in order to make quantitative reasoned decisions about acquiring something that they like. So chicks will acquire a preference for an object that they're raised with. They don't only imprint on their mothers, but kind of an object can, they can express an affinity for it as soon as they're hatched. So in this experiment, researchers put 2 opaque screens in front of the chick who was behind some type of clear barrier that wouldn't let them move quite yet. And what they did was they put some of the object that the chick preferred, in this case it was small yellow balls, they put some of them behind one opaque screen and some of them behind another opaque screen, and let the baby chick watch how many of them they were moving to each screen. And in order to show that the chicks were able to actually perform simple arithmetic on these amounts and not just do some form of counting, they moved some of these balls from one screen to another. And when the chicks were free, far more than 50% of the time, which would be the amount that the chicks would guess the right one based on random chance, they moved towards the right screen, or the screen that had more balls in it. And they did this of their own volition. Pigs can follow commands, use mouth-controlled joysticks to navigate a video game maze, and even use mirrors to manage navigating their surroundings. So after some acclimation period where pigs were given some mirrors in their pens, and they could kind of use them to search around and feel out the environment and even kind of perhaps recognize themselves, the researchers mention, they were set up with this kind of uniform experiment on which there was a wall separating the pigs from some food. They couldn't see the food. They couldn't see the food directly, but they could see it in a mirror. And within less than 29 seconds every time, as soon as the pig was left free to go search out the food, it turned straight around the corner and went for the food, as opposed to looking behind the mirror or in some completely unrelated place. Additionally, animals are not kind of automatons that just react to stimuli on a reflex basis and then immediately forget about it. Even animals as evolutionarily distant from us as fish, are capable of kind of having more long-term reactions to painful stimuli. And this could serve as evidence that animals experience pain with a certain amount of trauma, or at least complexity. So researchers in Norway, in this experiment, initially weren't even looking for any type of complex behavior from the fish. They were just trying to see if they touched the fish with like a hot element that hurt but didn't burn the fish, if they would react aversely. And sure enough, they did, and they found this pretty quickly. But soon afterwards, they noticing the fish kind of reluctant to explore their environment, swimming in one corner of the cage, not really feeding as often, and not swimming with the other fish in their original cages. So the researchers actually set out to quantify this, and they gave some of these fish painkillers, and some of them they didn't give painkillers to unrelatedly see if there was any effect of this painkiller on the stimulus of the reaction. Basically, what they found was that a day before and a full day after, the fish barely spent any time, or any of the percent of the time, kind of slowly hovering on the bottom, in the bottom half of their tanks. But 2 hours afterwards, they spent a significantly more amount of they spent significantly more time, and even more time if they weren't given painkillers, slowly and reluctantly, seemingly reluctantly hovering on the bottom of their tanks. And I would say that the fact that fish can react with complexity, which is expressed by altering the way that they behave in their surroundings, does say something about the billions of animals that we subject to kind of confined treatment every year. Scientists are not just on occasion, but it seems continuously surprised by the amount of social and emotional intelligence that animals show once they really start getting into it. We now know that animals not only feel pain and distress, but can actually recognize that pain and distress in others. So in a very recent experiment, this was published in Science just in December of last year, they gave rats the setup where one of them would be in a very trapped and confined cage and would be making distress noises. And they had previously taught, for another experiment entirely, some of the rats to open the cage by pressing the button and letting whatever was in that cage out. Not only did rats consistently free their trapped neighbors from this cage, but they even did it if there was temptation for a reward as an alternative. In one case, they put chocolate in another cage and let the rat decide whether they wanted to help their friend or get some chocolate. What they consistently did was they helped their friend, opened up the chocolate cage, then shared that chocolate with their neighbor. Just one more thing I wanted to mention, that it's the capability to recognize and internalize the distress of others that act upon it that we see as a really profoundly human trait. And we have a word that we typically only ascribe to other humans for this trait, which is empathy. And when this article came out, the prosocial and empathetic behavior of rats was the title for that study. And I think it's on the basis of this empathy that we should be considering not just how we eat, but who we eat. So far, I've detailed some of the environmental impacts previously and gone through some of the, what I believe some of the research attests to about sentience and welfare, which is that animals seem to have ways of reasoning, communicating, and suffering. That they're, unlike what some have previously thought, aware of pain, their surroundings, and of their peers, and highly aware. But lastly, I want to turn your attention to nutrition. Because as I mentioned before, I think a lot of this a lot of this information could potentially be overwhelming if you're left with not really being able to do anything about it. And I guess you felt resigned to eat a diet of twig and berries after learning this. But I want to make the argument that you can survive on these diets and not just you can not just survive on these diets, but you can thrive as well. And the sheer diversity of nutrients and flavors on a vegan diet are really, well, it's really large. And while a lot of people may agree about the environmental effects or be totally on the same page that animals may deserve better treatment, for those people, the response to cut meat and dairy out of their diets is about as absurd as this picture. A lot of people think it's really vital, and not to mention delicious in a lot of cases. But what I want to do is actually look a little bit at what the science actually says about this vitality. And we now know that animal products, many of them, are loaded in saturated fats, cholesterol, and carcinogens. Most whole animal products are very high in cholesterol, which can lead to accumulation in your blood of low-density lipoproteins, LDL, or the so-called bad cholesterol. That eventually leads to arterial plaque buildup and heart disease or stroke. A vegan diet, by the way, has no cholesterol in it. Not to mention the saturated fats, antibiotics, growth hormones, nitrates and ammonia to preserve and sanitize meat, and mutagenic compounds in red meat, and can still carry salmonella and E. coli when it's brought into your kitchen. The link between eating these foods and heart disease is increasingly well known. And the longitudinal studies, a lot of these long-term studies that track habits, that track eating habits and kind of causes of death or even illnesses along the way, which have been going from the mid-70s, the early 80s, and in the case of the Harvard Nurses study up till today, show that red meat and cholesterol consumption are correlated with a higher risk of heart disease. Heart disease is prevalent in the developing world and in countries where in countries with meat and dairy heavy diets. And in the US, heart disease is the leading cause of death. Cancer is the second leading cause, and we now know a lot more about the links to individual animal products and cancers, and individual cancers. So on the left here, I have foods that will raise one's risk significantly higher for the cancers on the right. For example, red meat, red and processed meats, which can increase the risk of colon cancer, potentially through a pathway through the type of iron that's available and abundant in red meats. Chicken can increase the risk of lymphoma and leukemia. Charred meat can, in some cases, double or triple the risk of pancreatic and some other stomach cancers through heterocyclic amines, which is a known carcinogen that increase significantly with burnt, charred, fried, or even very well done meat. And milk can raise the risk for prostate and ovarian cancers through the large amount of calcium potentially in these products. Vegans, meanwhile, and on a vegan diet, you can get every essential nutrient. They're all there. Complete proteins are in abundant amounts in legumes, beans, and lentils, a lot of whole grains, as well as soy products like edamame and tofu and tempeh. Calcium and iron are in large quantities in green leafy vegetables, broccoli, collard greens, spinach, kale, as well as a lot of different beans. B vitamins are in a whole host of different foods, from bananas to peanuts to to fortified cereals if this is something that you're already eating a lot during the morning anyway. And omega-3 fatty acids are, despite a lot of the health push to get people onto more seafood like salmon or eggs, some of which we talked about somewhat earlier, there are lots of plant foods that are abundant in omega-3 fatty acids, such as flax, walnuts, and avocado. The American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recently came out with a press release, or a couple years ago in 2009. By the way, this is the academy that certifies any registered dietitian in the country. They came out with a press release saying not only can a well-planned vegan or vegetarian or vegan diet be just as healthy as one with meat in it, but the abundance of vitamins, minerals, flavonoids, phytonutrients, dietary fiber, and antioxidants that are prevalent in plant-based diets can actually reduce your risk for some cancers and heart disease. And these nutrients are so abundant in vegan diets that a fair amount of pro athletes, some athletes now in nearly every competitive sport are going on to these vegan diets. Such as Tony Fiametta, recently drafted Patriots fullback, so recently that I couldn't find a picture of him in his Patriots jersey because we're still in the offseason. Mike Zigomanis, a Toronto Maple Leaf center. Ruth Heydrich, a 25-year vegan and winner of over 900 medals in both short and long distance events. And Jake Shields, a UFC and Strikeforce middleweight champion in mixed martial arts fighting. And on the note of surviving, not thriving, forgive the sarcastic note, I just wanted to mention that there really are a whole host of options and really tasty ones, some of which you fortunately got the chance to try out today, and we hope you liked. But these are just some pictures taken from one of my favorite blogs, the Post-Punk Kitchen. Up here is macaroni and cheese with cheese creamy sauce made out of sunflower seeds. Sloppy Joes made from seitan or wheat meat. An Asian soba noodle dish with I think is a cashew cream sauce and some chickpeas, as well as a marinara dish with tempeh, which is a fermented soy product from Indonesia, which may be as old as 1000 AD. And on the bottom here, I have some pictures that my friend Sheena made these bakery items and took those pictures herself. So I just thought I'd show them to you. So to wrap up this section on health and nutrition, there's an increasing amount of evidence that veganism is not only safe and healthy, but can prevent cancers and heart disease, and can also be delicious. So what I want to go to now is some steps to try out, because while all this information may be interesting or new, it can potentially feel overwhelming. So here are just a couple suggestions of things that you can try if you're willing or ready to. At the top of which, and I didn't want to mince words here, you could try going vegan. It's something that I jumped into. I spent a month on kind of a trial run back when I was 19, tried out a month of it, and have been vegan ever since. And it's worked pretty well for me, and I know of plenty others who it worked well for. But it's not necessarily a realistic first step for a lot of people here to take. So I included a lot else up here. And all of these are positive choices and positive impacts that you can have on your own diet, as well as I mentioned, animals and the environment. So exploring and discovering new food items, checking out things like, all the way from meat substitutes to, more ancient foods like quinoa, miso, and tempeh, some of the other things I mentioned during this talk. Or just a vegetable that you haven't tried before. Maybe now's the time to get into it, picking up a new ingredient from the farmer's market. And Louisa Dennison is here somewhere from the farmer's market, and strike up a conversation with her or see her at the farmer's market if you want some new fruits or veggies to try out. Also trying new recipes if you're ready to take an additional step and not just substituting an ingredient but a whole meal out. You can try replacing a meal or several, maybe see if your family is interested on getting on board with you. Or if you're somebody who happens to eat out a lot, try a veg-friendly restaurant in your neighborhood, some of which I've included the logos to right up here on this presentation. And there's not only an increasingly amount of them, but significantly more than when I even moved to the Boston area 3 years ago. and Boston's getting to be a much more friendly city for vegans and vegetarians alike. Another thing you can do is check out the vegetarian section of a restaurant that you've already been used to going and already frequent. Specifically, a lot of Eastern and Southern Asian restaurants have pretty robust vegetarian sections of their menus with new interesting ingredients or just awesome combinations that you have yet to try. As well as, because we're here at school, because I've had some luck with this with my own department, asking for more veggie options at your next social or departmental event. And I find that when I ask for them and we get a small amount, sometimes they're the first thing to be gone, because, as I think today attests to, there's really an increasing amount of interest on this campus as well. And the very last thing I wanted to mention is the importance of coming together. For me, community and support were instrumental for me making some of the steps towards vegetarianism and ultimately diving right into veganism. I had a community of friends who was interested in having potlucks and social events that introduced me to way more than I could discover on my own all at once, and I had a great time doing it. So with when something by yourself, I think, can seem like a real challenge, but with others around you, what starts out as a challenge can very quickly become an opportunity for exploration and trying new things. So everything from going halves on a meal with a friend of yours who also might be interested, to sharing recipes and ideas from people close to you, department mates, office mates, coworkers, friends and family, to doing full-fledged social events that serve as introductions for a whole group of people to new recipes, and contributing pieces of that, having a potluck, having a picnic or a cookout where you invite and challenge other people to come up with new recipes, new ideas that you can all share together. So with that, I really want to thank everyone for coming out today. Special thanks to Becky and Jill for helping me set up this event, who were instrumental. Louisa Dennison, as I mentioned, from Dining Services and the Food Literacy Project. Stephanie Bain, who I don't see here, but helped me out with some materials, as well as my friend Heather over there on this wall, if you want to check them out after the talk's done. And all of my friends who I talked to about this for giving me encouragement and support to bring this to you guys today. So with that, I want to leave it open for questions, and thank you again for coming. Yeah, so let's just jump right into the Q&A, if you could. So we mentioned get them recorded.
My name's Lisa Alexander, and I work at Mass DEP. Mm-hmm. And your point about the Amazon really hit home for me, because when I was making a decision about what I was going to do with my career, it was a lecture on the Amazon rainforest being burned down that made me go into environmental engineering. But what you're talking about is a better way to preserve the rainforest rather than just cleaning up one site at a time, which is what we do, kind of. And I actually would love to have you come to DEP and talk to us, if you would, and bring your presentation. We could record it for you if you'd like and distribute it, because this really speaks to a lot of what we try to do and helps people with health and everything else. So that's my question, if you would come.
More of a comment than a question. Yeah, let's, I think for this and others, something that I want to mention at this point is that we can, if people want to, and if people want to stick around, there's cake that we have yet to jump into, and desserts over here. So if you want to, and maybe it can serve as an incentive to stick around and have a more informal discussion if you want after this. And thank you for that. And if anyone, thank you. Thanks, Steve. And you know, if people want to stick around and have a discussion, and I can give you my contact information at that point. All right, yeah, let's keep the questions going. Could you pass this back over there? Thanks.
So I've heard the argument about food scarcity a number of times, but I've also heard that we actually produce enough food. It's just a distribution problem. And so if we all start eating vegan, how is that going to change the fact that some people produce food and they're not going to give it away for free, or we're not going to like ship it to places where there's, it's not really clear to me that that's a solution.
Right. So it is the case that thanks for that question. It is the case that we currently export a lot of food in the United States, and that food scarcity itself is not really an issue in the U.S. I think it does have a lot to do with actually giving a more nuanced look of how distribution in our food system goes is very important. And I'll have to think about the food scarcity issue, honestly. I do think it's the case that eating differently here could potentially positively affect many of the other things that I talked about. But good question. Thanks for that. If you'd want to pass it to that person further in the back.
One of the most common criticisms that I hear from friends and family about veganism is that our bodies are built to be able to process meat, and so we should, because we're evolutionarily sort of supposed to eat meat. And I can never come up with a clever response or an intelligent response to that, so I'm just curious if you have an insight on that.
It's a very good question, and I think here's the way that I normally approach it, because I've also been asked that question, which is that evolution doesn't put us on a single destined track. Evolution sometimes develops capacities and capabilities in animals or any organism to actually be able to have a versatile response to our surroundings. Wish I could give you the citation on it, but there was a recent article in Scientific American that was inappropriately titled, "Most of our ancestors were vegetarians." But what they really meant to say is all of our ancestors were mostly vegetarians. And really what the article went into is how what we're evolutionarily adapted to, it seems, is to have our guts and our internal system, our metabolism, be meant to digest and metabolize a really diverse diet. And that doesn't just mean eating everything under the sun, but actually adapting to plenty of different diets. With that being the case, I think it's important that we let the science show us what the sheer diversity of those diets could be. And when I see long-term studies, when I see individual studies saying that vegans end up just as healthy and they end up doing pretty well with things like cancer and heart disease, then I'm also very willing to acknowledge that. All right, can we pass the mic along to this gentleman over here?
I can maybe help answer that question. The Massachusetts Animal Rights Coalition, MARC, they have a nice little printout that shows the complete digestive systems of carnivores, omnivores, herbivores, and humans, starting from the facial muscles and teeth and everything all the way through. And it shows that the humans match up with the herbivores, and an omnivore digestive system matches up with carnivores. It's pretty impressive to see. They look at everything, the physiology, morphology, and we're just designed to eat plants, basically.
It's also an argument that I've heard before. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Part of the problem among people I've talked to is that eating vegan, eating healthy, eating vegetarian can be seen as costing a lot more in both money and time. So there's a lot of social, economic, and class issues involved. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, this is also, it's also an important issue. And I mean, it's important to make sure that our suggestions are upscalable to people outside of our immediate social or economic conditions. I will say that to somebody who's just merely trying to substitute all of the meat and dairy in their diets with with fake meats and dairies, it can get awfully expensive. But I will say that the way that I prefer to eat, the way that many vegans and vegetarians I know eat, use very little of these products. And pretty much everything that I showed you, most of the things that I showed you here, the legumes, the greens, the bananas and the peanuts, these things are all relatively inexpensive and ideally should be eaten in omnivorous meat and dairy-heavy diets as well. So for me, what I actually notice more, and what's more important and compelling to me, is the sometimes prohibitive cost of merely eating more fruits and vegetables. And I think that's something that omnivores and vegans alike can begin to start addressing. Up front here.
I have a question somewhat related to that. In the health portion of your talk, you talked a lot about the health benefits of eating a plant-based diet versus a diet that includes meat and dairy, and then also talk about the price. Something related to plants and price would be organic versus non-organic.
Right.
The various ways that we can buy plant-based food.
Right.
Have there been any studies done that have shown any sort of health difference in those things?
Between organics and conventional, for instance? Yeah, in fact, one came out very recently that I just saw in a news article that it said in some ways they could see small difference between pesticide residues, but in other ways there wasn't that much of a difference. On the other hand, I know of reports from the Environmental Working Group that shows up to 80% or up to 4 times more pesticides in conventional produce and in some of the dirtiest conventional produce than in their organic analogs. So it's not something that I can tell you there's one story one way or the other on. But I'd really want to look more into that information and perhaps incorporate.
Yeah, because I was thinking how that relates to the class issues in trying to eat healthy.
Right, because organics can be very prohibitive, and they can be prohibitive for meat as well as dairy products. And in terms of some of those class issues, I would like to see a lot more of what I think is currently going on, which is eliminating so-called food deserts where inner city or rural communities don't have anything but a convenience store or a wholesaler to go to, or increasing access to farmers markets through food stamps, community initiatives, et cetera. I think all of these are good things. All right. There was some woman in the back with her hand raised. Oh, well, Megan, you go first. Right.
Yeah, well, I'll probably get at you later because I have a bunch of questions about going raw, but...
Okay. Is there one? Or is there a front runner?
Yeah, probably soy and hormone levels.
So could you specify a little more? Because I think I know what you're getting
What
at.
is your take on all those studies about hormone levels in soy and soy products and...
Right. So yeah, I've heard some of this before, that soy is, it's an isoflavone. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. But it's essentially, it can mock in a lot of ways, or it can kind of fill up your receptors for estrogen in your hormonal system. And because of that, because your body is getting that kind of replicate estrogen, your testosterone levels could potentially decrease. And this is something that they found pumping rats full of soy protein to kind of ungodly levels. And so it's something, this idea that soy can mess with your hormones, specifically if you're a man, is something that I've heard all the way from kind of meat and dairy lobbying publications to New Age health and holistic blogs. But it's one that's unfounded by multiple long-term studies and meta-analyses that show that soy consumption, even far beyond the level of your average Asian male, and a lot of Asian populations do eat a lot of soy, are perfectly healthy and make no significant effect on hormones. That's not to say that there's not some reason, if you want to be reluctant about eating too much soy. But in general, I think it's a good idea to be eating diverse and varied ingredients and proteins. So I would definitely recommend that to anyone who has any reservations about eating too much soy in their diet.
I guess there's a second part to my question. Just, I know a lot of soy products are also really processed. So how does that really affect your carbon footprint at all? Is it really lowering it if you're having like a vegan option, like, I don't know, say Boca Burgers? I don't know anything about that, but something that's more processed, does it also negatively impact the environment or your body?
I do know in some non-organic processed soy products they use some potentially sketchy chemicals, but there are also organic and even some non-organic soy products that don't seem to pose any of those risks. I haven't heard any health studies being done on the actual longer-term effects of processed soy. I wouldn't be surprised if those are somewhere in the pipelines with more vegans eating more meat substitutes. Wait, what haven't I answered? I had another point there.
Okay.
I forget it.
Just the carbon footprint.
The carbon
aspect,
footprint,
yeah.
right. No, I don't know of, and it would have been interesting to look further into kind of the, that pie chart that I showed of the emissions of the transportation of the production. What part of that production might actually be due to the processing of food products in general. I think if you had that number, you might actually be able to tack a number onto what it might take to process soybeans into a soy patty. But I don't think it would be overwhelming in the kind of greenhouse gas emissions budget of food products. So now there's this woman in the back, and I think this will be the last question, after which people are free to go up and get some cakes. Probably use the same fork or spoon you've been eating. And we'll just break off into kind of an informal discussion. So.
Hi. I've read from some sources that the animal rights movement is very similar to the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement in the past 100 years or so, where they used to be very fringe issues, but more recently they've become much more mainstream. Mm-hmm. How feasible do you think that is in the next couple of decades, that this will be an issue that the general population addresses?
To see a mass movement of animal rights.
Yeah, or a transition to more plant-based diets.
Well, I think the transition to more plant-based diets is happening. I've heard somewhere, maybe off an infographic, that the number has doubled sometime within the last decade. I don't have a source on that for you, but I do know that the amount of vegetarian and vegan restaurants in the city, from my perspective, seems to have doubled at least since 3 years ago. I believe it. I don't know. I don't feel totally qualified to answer that question because I don't feel like a historian of social movements. I do think this is gaining more momentum. I do think that in some ways it might be seen as similar to those movements, but it has many other differences. And it's something that I think, sorry to hedge here, but I would love to have a more detailed discussion with some of you about if you're willing. So, all right, let's go eat some cake. Thank you, everyone.